Good morning to you all and welcome to the 9th lecture of the 2020 Palliative Care Lecture Series. Hospice New Zealand would like to thank and acknowledge Cancer Research Trust New Zealand for their generous support and funding to deliver these free lectures. The lecture today will be recorded and it will be available on the Hospice New Zealand website. Please be aware there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. We would now like to introduce our guest speaker today, Lis Heath. Welcome, Liz. Please go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to share my research with you today. This topic is part of my doctoral research project that explores medical and nursing graduates' preparation, self-efficacy and attitudes towards providing palliative and end-of-life care. Now, if you move to slide 2, I'll quickly give you an overview of my presentation. So today I'll be presenting the results of the first phase of this project, which surveyed medical and nursing schools throughout New Zealand to obtain information about how palliative and end-of-life care is taught in their respective undergraduate curriculums. I'll start by briefly describing my professional background to give you some context. Then I'll ask you to think back to your early learning experiences in palliative and end-of-life care with 3 short reflective questions. I'll then explain the socio-political background for the study, including what's going on around the world in terms of palliative care in undergraduate curricula, before we look at the program requirements in New Zealand. Then I'll briefly describe the project and present the findings from my research so far, including recommendations that will help improve access to primary palliative care for all New Zealanders. But first I'd like to acknowledge my research supervisors and the Department of Medicine at the Otago Medical School for their support. I'd also like to acknowledge the scholarship I received from the University of Otago that's provided financial support for this research. So my career began as a nurse aide, as we were then called, in a hospital-level aged care facility at the age of 17. It was here that I had my first experiences of death and dying in a professional capacity. And like many people, I can still vividly recall my first patient who died. She was an elderly resident that I'd grown quite fond of. She had no family to be with her in her final hours and she was afraid. So I sat with her holding her hand and she passed away peacefully later that night. This had a real impact on me at the time, and I remember feeling incredibly honoured to have been able to bring her some comfort in her final hours. I went on to do my nursing training at Otago Polytechnic a few months later and worked at a psychiatric hospital in holidays and weekends throughout my training. Once I qualified as a registered nurse, I worked in psychogeriatrics before moving into neurosurgery and neurology, where I spent some time before heading off to the UK for my OE, where I experienced the NHS from both sides of the bed. Professionally, I spent much of my time working at the Royal Free in Hampstead, and personally in St George's Hospital in London, where I spent a fairly miserable 3 weeks, followed by a further 2 weeks in a hospital in France. And it was this experience that taught me what it means to be a patient and how important it is to hold on to your humanity in healthcare. And it forced me to make a choice, either leave nursing altogether or use my experience to help others learn, and I obviously chose the latter. On returning to New Zealand, I worked in a variety of clinical areas before returning to my previous position in neurosurgery and neurology, where I later took on an additional role as a service educator, and this marks the beginning of my career into healthcare education. And when I look back, many of the patients we cared for then would meet the criteria for palliative care now. But at that time, palliative care was in its infancy in New Zealand, and we didn't really know much about it. And like most others, I had not learned about palliative or end-of-life care in my training. We did our best with what we had, but if we knew then what we know now, their care could have been so much better. I knew then that caring for people with terminal conditions and those who were dying was one of the parts of my job I found the most satisfying, because I knew I could make a real difference with some compassion and good nursing care. Some years later, I chose to specialise in palliative care and went to work at the Otago Community Hospice, where I was employed to establish the education service. I also worked clinically in the IPU and later took up an additional role as a service development coordinator when we were developing the regional outreach services. It was during this time that I obtained my master's degree, where I explored the impact of palliative care education on care assistants working in residential aged care facilities. And that project took me full circle back to where my career began. After 11 years at the hospice, it was time for a new challenge. So I took up a position in the Department of Medicine at the Otago Medical School to develop a new program in ambulatory medicine for the new curriculum. Then in 2012, I was asked to develop the palliative care teaching at the medical school, which is one of the programs I now convene, while also remaining clinically active at the hospice. And so I have a foot in both camps as a nurse working in a medical school. And this gives me insight into the learning needs of both nursing and medical students, hence why I chose to include both occupational groups in the study I'm presenting today. So I'll start by asking you to think back to how you first learned to care for people who were dying. Was it through trial and error by learning on the job, or by watching how others did it? Did you attend courses or seminars on this subject? Or did you have previous personal experience caring for a friend or family member who died before you began your training? Or like me, did you have healthcare experience beforehand? The second question, when you think back to your undergraduate training, did you receive any formal teaching about palliative and end-of-life care? And think about lectures, tutorials, or other experiences that were part of the taught curriculum. And the final question asks you to reflect back on your earliest experiences of death as a new graduate, that if you're anything like me, you can probably still remember, and consider how well prepared were you for that experience. So let's have a look at the background for this study first. As we know, advances in chronic disease management combined with an ageing population have led to an increasing prevalence of patients with multimorbidities and complex needs and an increasing demand for palliative care. And this reflects global trends in developed countries that experience the post-war baby boom and now face similar issues. In fact, the National Health Needs Assessment for Palliative Care reports that we're expecting to see a 50% increase in deaths in New Zealand by 2038, with a corresponding 51% increase in palliative care needs, and that will be reflected across all healthcare settings. 80% of these people will be cared for by primary palliative care providers, because we know the majority of people with life-limiting conditions do not require specialist palliative care unless their needs exceed the knowledge and skills of primary care providers. This was supported in a 2013 study carried out by Miriam Gott and her colleagues at Auckland City Hospital, which reported 20% of hospital inpatients at the time met the criteria for palliative care need. And that's 1 in 5 patients. Most of those patients were aged over 70, and 2/3 died within 6 months of admission. So the 2017 review of adult palliative care services reported that 34% of deaths in New Zealand currently occur in hospitals where junior and medical staff play a key role in direct patient care, yet they have the least training and experience. If 1 in 5 hospital inpatients have palliative care needs, it follows that palliative care will be a core part of everyday practice for most graduates as soon as they qualify. And this is supported in a 2015 study by Barclay in the UK that reported graduates can expect to care for approximately 40 patients who die and a further 120 who are close to the end of life in their first year after qualifying. There is also a consistent theme in the literature which shows that medical and nursing graduates both feel unprepared for palliative and end-of-life care and find it one of the most challenging and stressful parts of their work. This not only compromises patient care, but also contributes to graduates' anxiety and undermines their self-efficacy at a critical point in their professional development. There's another issue we also need to be concerned about, and that is the sustainability of the palliative care workforce, the majority of which in New Zealand are aged over 55. This will inevitably restrict access to palliative care if we do not attract others into the specialty, and that needs to begin with education at the undergraduate level. The Quality of Death Index, which ranks palliative care around the world, also warns that countries without sufficient training resources are likely to face a shortage of specialist staff, while non-specialists may lack the skills to provide quality care if they do not receive adequate education. So let's have a look at what's happening around the world. And firstly, a systematic review by Lloyd Williams and McLeod in 2004 showed that despite widespread acknowledgement in the international literature about the importance of including palliative care in undergraduate education, There was a lack of research in palliative care education, and teaching had developed in an ad hoc manner that lacked consistency, coordination, and was rarely assessed. The authors recommended an integrated approach to teaching, beginning early in training to reinforce principles and practice throughout the curriculum. Barriers included overcrowded curricula, lack of a local champion, and a healthcare system that prioritises curative treatment over quality of life and the benefits of palliative care. Unfortunately, palliative and end-of-life care has been neglected in undergraduate education until relatively recently. This began to change in the late 90s and early 2000s with an increasing number of reports in the international literature emphasising the need for education in this area, coupled with reports of educational innovations and evaluations of palliative care teaching. These improvements were largely driven by recommendations from government and professional bodies in response to forecasts of overwhelming need. Having said that, undergraduate palliative care education remains optional in most countries, with the exception of the UK, the USA, Canada, Germany, France, Austria, and Poland, where it's a mandatory requirement. We're also seeing increased availability of online learning resources, including the PCC4U program in Australia, ELNEC, or the End of Life Nursing Education Consortium in the USA, which is an international train-the-trainer program for nurse educators, and EduPAL in Europe, which was launched at the European Association for Palliative Care conference in Berlin last year, and is aimed primarily at undergraduate medical education, but I believe would be easily transferable to nursing. But despite the advances of recent years, there is high variability amongst education providers in terms of delivery, content, curriculum time, and organisation, especially if there are no associated competency requirements. And graduates continue to report feeling unprepared, although it's difficult to know if this is because of a lack of education or the inherently challenging nature of this work, or both. So how much is enough? Well, the EAPC recommends a minimum of 40 hours of formal teaching in palliative care for undergraduate medical students, but there are no similar guidelines in terms of contact time for nursing. So what's happening in New Zealand? Well, there is very little information available in the literature about this, so we first need to look at what the requirements for undergraduate training providers are. Then I hope my research findings will go some way towards answering this question. So the New Zealand Palliative Care Strategy was first published in 2001, recommended that New Zealand Medical and Nursing Councils provide guidance on the minimum content required for palliative care education at undergraduate level. It also recommended that medical schools implement the Australasian Medical Undergraduate Palliative Care Curriculum, which I take to mean is the PCC4U course, although that's Palliative Care for You. Then in 2017, the Ministry of Health once again published the Palliative Care Action Plan, which was informed by the review of adult palliative care services in New Zealand and some very good work done by the Palliative Care Council. One of the priorities that identified was to ensure all New Zealanders have access to palliative care by ensuring all healthcare professionals have the skills required to provide a primary palliative care approach. And this, I believe, is for two reasons. Firstly, that 80% of palliative care is provided by non-specialists, and secondly, there are significant parts of the population, especially in rural and remote areas of New Zealand, that do not have access to palliative care because it's either not available or they have to travel long distances to access it. This means that access to palliative care in New Zealand depends on where you live and what level of services are available in that area. These action points provide a very clear mandate for nursing and medical council to introduce competencies to guide curriculum development, without which teaching about palliative and end-of-life care will remain optional and at risk of being squeezed out in favour of other topics. Education is fundamental to raising the level of competency amongst all healthcare providers. As the old saying goes, a rising tide lifts all boats. So it's now 19 years since the first palliative care strategy was released in New Zealand. And how are we doing? Well, when we look at the program standards for RNs, there are no specific competencies related to palliative and end-of-life care. Instead, Nursing Council encourages nursing schools to take a lifespan or a health continuum approach, which infers end-of-life care might be included, but is rather vague and open to interpretation, and there are no minimum requirements for palliative care education. This was reflected in a 2008 survey that included 6 of our 17 nursing schools, which found no identifiable modules in palliative care, but rather an integrated approach to teaching. But that made it difficult to determine what was covered and reflected a lack of visibility and inconsistency between programs. Since then, Palliative Care New Zealand has developed a professional development framework which includes core competencies for all registered nurses, but these have yet to be adopted by Nursing Council. So when we look at medicine, end-of-life care is included in the supplementary guidance for end-of-life care published by the Medical Council of New Zealand Standards for Good Medical Practice. However, it fails to go any further than this one catch-all statement: take steps to alleviate pain or distress whether or not a cure is possible. At Otago University, the curriculum map, which provides the key elements of learning in the MBCHB program, palliative care is represented in 2 of the 155 core presentations, and they're listed there for you. Work has also been undertaken at a national level between Otago and Auckland universities to develop a combined palliative care curriculum with shared learning outcomes and objectives. So that's the background for the study, and I hope you can see why this topic is important in terms of our ability to meet the needs of the population into the future. So as I mentioned earlier, this is part of my PhD research, and it investigates nursing and medical graduates' preparation, self-efficacy and attitudes towards providing palliative and end-of-life care. This is a mixed methods project with explanatory sequential design and involves 3 distinct phases, the first of which I'm discussing today are the results of the National Survey of Undergraduate Nursing and Medical Schools in New Zealand. Phase 2 is a national survey of medical and nursing graduates from the 2018 cohort to investigate their self-efficacy and attitudes towards providing palliative and end-of-life care using 2 internationally validated scales that were adapted for the New Zealand context with permission from the authors Stephen Mason and John Alishaw from Liverpool University. And I finished out a collection for that back in February of this year. Phase 3 involves semi-structured interviews with a group of participants from the Phase 2 survey to explore factors in their undergraduate training that influence their self-efficacy and attitudes towards providing palliative and end-of-life care. And I completed the last of those interviews the day before we went into level 4 lockdown. So the aim of the Phase 1 survey was to obtain information about the provision of palliative and end-of-life care teaching in the Bachelor of Nursing and MBCHB programs in New Zealand. The reason I included both occupational groups was not to make comparisons between medicine and nursing, but because they are both at the front line of patient care, have similar learning needs and experience similar issues, as I mentioned earlier. The survey was delivered using the Qualtrics survey platform and was based on a UK survey that was adapted with permission from the first author, Stephen Walker, at St Giles Medical in London. The study received ethical approval from the University of Otago in January of last year. So the head of each school was first contacted to obtain the names and contact details of the person or people responsible for organising palliative care teaching in their school. Invitations were then sent out to each course coordinator with the information sheet and a link to the survey, which was front-loaded with the consent form. Responses are therefore based on subjective reporting from course coordinators and is not a formal audit of the curriculum. The survey inquired about organisation, teaching time, clinical contact with palliative care providers, as well as teaching methods, course content, assessment and barriers to curriculum development. There are currently 17 polytechs and universities that deliver the Bachelor of Nursing program, and they are currently being amalgamated under one umbrella, the New Zealand Institute of Skills and Technology, following an announcement by the Minister of Education last year. In medicine, Auckland and Otago universities provide the MBCHB program with clinical teaching schools based in Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin. I use a starter software to analyse the results after separating the nursing from the medical data, and this slide presents the combined results in each of the following areas. The response rates, firstly, 100% of medical schools and 76% of nursing schools completed the survey. One additional nursing school replied to say they couldn't participate because no one was responsible for palliative care teaching and that it was not assessed, but it was integrated through a lifespan approach. One other nursing school declined due to stress on staff at the time, and no reply was received from the other schools despite several invitations to do so. In terms of formal teaching time, in the 3-year Bachelor of Nursing program, 84% of nursing schools indicated they provide between 1 and 10 hours of formal teaching in palliative and end-of-life care, most of which was integrated across the program in the form of lectures. 2 further schools reported 21 to 30 hours and 31 to 40 hours, respectively, indicating isolated pockets where teaching is more well developed. In medicine, 3 of the 4 medical schools reported 40 hours or more of formal palliative and end-of-life care teaching across the 5-year program, which excludes health sciences first year, with 1 school reporting 21 to 30 hours. Medicine has more hours partly because it's a longer course and also because there's been increased emphasis on palliative care curriculum development in recent years. It was good to see that there is an identified lead person or persons in 92% of the nursing schools that responded and 100% of medical schools. Responsibilities are often shared with 1 or more people. Program evaluation reflects a commitment to ongoing improvement. So it was good to see that 92% of nursing schools that responded and all medical schools formally evaluate their palliative care teaching. Assessment, however, was less well developed, with 54% of nursing schools and 75% of medical schools including palliative care and formal assessment processes. So now we'll separate the data and look at the nursing schools first. This slide presents the methods that are commonly used for palliative care teaching, and unsurprisingly, lectures and tutorials are most common, probably because they're the most efficient and cost-effective way of conveying information to a large group of students. This is followed by case or problem-based teaching and supervised clinical experience in palliative care, both of which give students an opportunity to apply and integrate their learning. It's good to see increasing use of simulation, and there's growing evidence for this in the literature. Films, DVDs and podcasts are also used in 5 schools, but it's surprising that reflective learning activities are not used more often, as palliative care lends itself well to this. E-learning and role play, as you can see, are underutilised, with only 1 school using each of these methods. There are many good e-learning resources available now, as I mentioned earlier, which can easily be incorporated into education and it offers great flexibility, especially in these COVID times. So while role play is often the subject of collective groans, they do have their place and appeal to different learning styles by providing a creative way of helping students and demonstrate their understanding. And finally, patient presentations and interviews are provided at only 2 schools, but interviews with informal carers are not provided at all. However, they do offer valuable opportunities to learn about the lived experience for both patients and carers. This table shows the placements with palliative care providers and the length of time they're able to spend in those settings. It was difficult for course coordinators to report this accurately, as contact with palliative care patients is often opportunistic, although these are settings where this is most likely to occur. As you can see, placements in residential aged care facilities are common, most of which are for a week or more in duration. District nursing and primary care are also available, with some exposure to hospital palliative care, although the numbers here are very low. Placements with hospice and palliative care providers are available, but they are very limited. So generally, they're only available for senior students as elective placements. and the experience that offered will depend on the range of services available in each location. It's good to see that some nursing students are able to spend time with hospital palliative care services, but again, the numbers here are very low and are likely to occur on ward-based placements where the hospital palliative care team may be involved. It's important to note that nursing students have a range of clinical placements over the course of their degree, and the type of placements they have will depend on what's available and how many students can be accommodated. So not all students will experience the same placements, with variability in the type and duration. So this slide is a bit overwhelming at first glance, but it shows the range of topics that are considered core content for palliative care curriculum. The blue and red bars indicate the topics that are either not covered or there's only a little teaching on this topic. The green and purple bars indicate those topics that course coordinators thought were adequately or comprehensively addressed. It's important to note that this data is based on subjective reporting, which means participants may have either over or underrepresented the teaching they provide. So we'll flick over quickly to slide 24, which summarises the content of that slide, and that might be helpful for those of you who are reading off a black and white handout. And as you can see, over 50% of course coordinators reported that they provide adequate or comprehensive teaching on many of the subjects included in the survey. And these subjects may be addressed in various parts of the curriculum because palliative care is delivered in an integrated fashion. However, given most schools indicated they provide between 1 and 10 hours of formal teaching across the curriculum in palliative care, it's difficult to see how these topics can all be adequately addressed in the time available. Those that were either not covered or only covered a little include nutrition and hydration, agitation and confusion, nausea and vomiting, non-pharmacological symptom management and management of other symptoms such as lymphedema and fungating wounds, etc. Nurses deal with most of these issues every day, so this needs to be reflected in their learning. Palliative care emergencies, while not common, are also really taught, but as nurses are likely to be the ones managing these situations, they should be prepared. And while death certification is not strictly a nursing duty, nurses need to be aware of the legal requirements. Ethical and legal issues do warrant more attention, particularly if there is a change in legislation around euthanasia. So as I mentioned earlier, palliative care is assessed at 54% of the nursing schools that responded. And as we know, when it comes to exams, students are strategic learners, so if a subject is not assessed, they may see it as being less important. This graph shows the assessment tools that are used, with the blue bar being formative assessments that do not attract a grade, the red is summative that do attract a grade, and green indicates the methods that are used both formatively and summatively. We can see here that feedback from clinical placement providers is the most commonly used form of assessment. However, this feedback usually only provides comments on generic skills and it's not palliative care specific, unless of course the student's been involved in the care of a palliative care patient. Traditional assessment tools such as the short answer question, multi-choice questions and essays are used most often in both formative and summative assessment at 6 and 5 schools respectively. Simulation and case reports are used in both formative and summative assessment in 4 schools, while OSCEs are used in 3 schools. Given that reflective practice was indicated as an area that was well addressed, it is perhaps surprising that it's not used more in assessment, with only 2 schools reporting use of the reflective essay. It would make sense to incorporate this in any palliative and end-of-life care curriculum, which lends itself well to reflective writing and drives deep learning by giving students opportunities to think and write about challenging issues, which helps develop reflective practitioners. Extended multiple choice questions and observational clinical skills were likewise really used. So overall, there seems to be a lack of assessment in palliative care, and that may undermine the teaching that is provided. So we'll now turn to look at the medical school data. And because of the small numbers involved, I presented it in percentages to make it easier to see. It's clear that lectures, tutorials, and reflective activities are commonly used at all teaching sites. Supervised clinical experience is also available at all medical schools, although as we saw on a previous slide, this is only for a very limited time. This is followed by case discussion, which is a common learning tool in medical education, and DVD films and podcasts are used at 3 of the 4 schools. Role play, simulation and interviews or presentations with patients and or their carers are provided at 2 schools, but e-learning is clearly underutilised with only one site reporting its use. This slide provides an overview of the clinical attachments with palliative care providers for medical students. And once again, it was difficult for course coordinators to provide an accurate picture of this, as some contact occurs opportunistically and may be difficult to quantify. However, we can see that all medical schools offer clinical contact for all students with a palliative care service, albeit for a very limited time. We can see that students in one area are able to spend up to 1 week in a residential aged care facility, which is an ideal opportunity to learn about primary palliative care if students are well prepared beforehand. And this occurs at second year level in this particular school. Exposure to palliative care patients is not uncommon in general practice and primary care placements, which most medical schools provide, and palliative care electives are available in 2 schools for students who express an interest. Again, this slide shows the range of topics that are considered to be core components of an undergraduate curricula in palliative care. And once again, the blue and red bars indicate the topics that are either not covered or only covered a little, while the green and purple bars indicate the topics that are adequately or comprehensively addressed. And if you flip once again to the next slide, that provides a summary of the content from that one, which is a bit hard to look at. So as you can see, over 50% of course coordinators reported they provide adequate or comprehensive teaching on many of the subjects included. But there are a number of areas that warrant more attention. And these include communicating in high-stakes situations, which is a core skill for any doctor, cultural and religious issues to do with death and dying, spirituality, palliative care emergencies, management of other symptoms, nutrition and hydration, and agitation and confusion, which they have in common with nursing, constipation, last days of life, loss, grief and bereavement, and personal coping. And again, any change in the legislation around euthanasia will require significant educational input. So clearly there's room for development. So as I mentioned earlier, palliative care is included in student assessment at 3 of the 4 medical schools. And this graph indicates the methods that are used. The reflective essay and multi-choice questions are the favoured approaches, with a variety of other methods used across the board. However, this only accounts for a small number. And if it's true that assessment drives learning, a more consistent and coordinated approach to assessment between schools may be helpful. So the final survey question I want to report here are the barriers to development of palliative care education. And this slide shows the combined data from both medical and nursing schools. So like the systematic review by Lloyd, Williams and McLeod that I talked about earlier, it seems that pressure on curriculum time and squeezing new material into an already overcrowded curriculum is still the greatest barrier to development. However, with that said, the curriculum must reflect national health priorities, and the Ministry of Health has clearly identified palliative care as one of those in both strategies in 2001 and again in 2017. Lack of clinical placements was the next most cited barrier at 63%, which reflects the limited capacity for palliative care services to accommodate students. Lack of assessment and teaching staff was cited by 3 schools each, with a lack of suitable teaching tools by 2, although there has been a significant shift towards e-learning since COVID, so this may have improved since the survey was conducted. It is indeed encouraging to see that lack of leadership was not a major issue, and no one reported a lack of support for palliative care teaching. So while there's plenty of room for development, there is a lot of good work taking place in this space. To finish, I've identified some key recommendations at both national and regional levels that will help progress this work towards ensuring our graduates are capable of providing primary palliative care. These recommendations are presented at national and regional levels. The first and most important recommendation is for the Nursing and Medical Councils of New Zealand to ensure that competencies in palliative and end-of-life care are included as a mandatory requirement in undergraduate training to meet the Ministry of Health recommendations and international guidelines, and to secure a curriculum time and resources needed to enable ongoing development in this area. This will also help address the shortages in the palliative care workforce in the long term. The second recommendation at national level is to develop guidelines for the integration of palliative and end-of-life care into undergraduate education. And these two recommendations need to occur simultaneously. At the regional level, each medical and nursing school needs to include comprehensive learning outcomes and objectives in palliative and end-of-life care to focus teaching efforts and ensure students know what they're expected to learn and be capable of by the time they graduate. And this needs to be included in all curriculum documents like any other core subject. Given the very limited clinical contact available with specialist palliative care providers, palliative and end-of-life care needs to be embedded in all clinical placements, especially residential aged care, primary care and hospital wards, with foundational concepts introduced at an early stage in their learning to prepare them for clinical encounters with palliative care patients and families on placement. This will help students recognise and respond to patients' palliative care needs with the support from their clinical tutors and specialist services as required, and build their competency in primary palliative care as they progress through their training. Finally, palliative care needs to be included in assessment processes throughout the curriculum. Without this, we have no way of knowing whether learning outcomes have been achieved, and students will fail to give palliative and end-of-life care the priority it deserves and may see it as being less important than other subjects which are assessed. We also need to be mindful of the implicit message we are sending students if palliative care is not included in their assessment. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I hope you found it interesting and informative. If you'd like to get in touch, please feel free to send me an email. Well, just thank you very much for getting up early to come along and listen to my presentation. I hope you found it interesting. I think there is a lot of really good work happening around the country, and I want to really acknowledge that. But I do believe that we've got a long way to go, and I hope that in time we will be able to chip away at some of those recommendations. So go well and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
On behalf of Hospice New Zealand and the registered sites, we would like to thank Liz for sharing her time and knowledge with us this morning. And thank you everyone for listening today. We hope you found the lecture interesting and informative. Have a great day.